By the second autumn, folks in Larkspur Hollow would swear they always knew how it would turn out between the widow Combs and Wyatt Calder. They did not know. On the morning it started, most of them were only there for the joke. Sarah Combs stood on the plank walk outside the feed store with her late husband's coat buttoned wrong at the collar and a carpetbag at her feet that held everything she owned, which was not much. It was hiring day, the one Saturday each spring when the Valley ranchers came into town to pick out cook help for the season, and the women who needed the work stood along the rail in a loose line like they were waiting on a train that might not come. Sarah had walked 4 miles to get there. She'd not eaten since the day before, and she had learned in the 11 months since Daniel died of the fever how to stand so that nobody could tell that. Hollis Pruitt went down the line first, a red-faced man with a ranch twice the size of anyone else's, and a voice that liked being heard. He asked the usual questions: biscuits, beans, how many hands could she feed at once? And the women answered the way you answer a man who was deciding whether you eat that week. When he got to Sarah, he stopped and looked at the coat, too big, a man's coat, and at her hands, which did not shake, and something in her stillness seemed to annoy him. "You cooked for a ranch before?" "I cooked for a household," Sarah said. "My husband and I ran a small place east of here before he passed." "Small place?" Pruitt said it like it settled something. He was already turning to the next woman when he tossed the question back over his shoulder, more for the men leaning on the rail than for her. "Can you even boil water?" A couple of the hands laughed, the easy kind of laugh that cost the laugher nothing. Sarah did not answer right away. She looked at Pruitt long enough that the laugh had time to finish and die off on its own. And then she said, "Yes, and I know what to do with it after." And that was all. And some of the men stopped laughing because there was nothing funny left in it. Only a woman who had answered a stupid question honestly and was now waiting for the next one. There was no next one from Pruitt. He moved on down the line and did not look back. And word of it moved through the gathered crowd the way these things do, quick and low, so that by the time the hiring was done and the ranchers were loading their new cooks into wagons, Sarah Combs was still standing on the plank walk with her carpetbag, unhired, and a good many people had heard the question and the answer both, and had already decided which one they would repeat at supper. She did not cry. She had promised herself, packing that carpetbag in the empty house that no longer belonged to her, that she would not cry in this town, not once, not where anyone could see it and decide it was a performance. She picked up the bag and started walking toward the church, where the deacon's wife sometimes let stranded women sleep a night in the storeroom. And she did not know yet that a man on a bay gelding at the far end of the street had watched the whole exchange without saying a word, and that he would remember the exact sound of her answer for a long time afterward, the flatness of it, the lack of pleading in it, and that this would matter more than either of them understood yet. Wyatt Calder had come to town for rope and nails and had not planned on hiring anybody. His own cook, old Ezra, had gone to live with his sister in Cheyenne the week before, and Wyatt had been getting by on his own bad coffee and the hand's worst biscuits, telling himself he would deal with it after spring branding. He had not gone down to the hiring line. He did not like the look of it, the way it turned people into livestock for an hour, though he had never said so out loud to anyone. But he had heard Pruitt's question carried down the street, and he had heard the answer, and something about the woman's face when she said it, unbothered on the surface and something else entirely underneath, the way a creek looks calm on top, and you only find out about the current when you step in it, stayed with him past the feed store, and past the rope, and past the nails, all the way to the edge of town, where he sat the bay a minute longer than he needed to, watching a woman he did not know walk toward the church with a bag too heavy for the distance she had left to go. He told himself it was practical. He would tell himself that for weeks. He had ridden past the church twice more before he finally turned the bay around, telling himself the first time that he'd forgotten a coil of rope at the feed store, and the second time that he ought to check whether the road west was still soft from the last rain, neither of which was true, both of which gave him an excuse to pass the same stretch of plank walk again and see whether the woman with the too big coat was still sitting where he'd left her in his mind, if not in fact. She was. She had not moved much, only shifted the carpet bag closer to her feet, and something about the patience in that, a woman waiting out a bad hour without making a show of how bad it was, decided the matter for him before his own good sense caught up to argue against it. He found her outside the church an hour later, sitting on the step with the carpet bag between her feet, and he did not dismount right away. He sat the bay and looked at her, and she looked back at him without standing, without arranging her face into anything hopeful, and he respected that more than he could have explained. "I've got a ranch 2 hours west," he said. "Lost my cook last week. 12 hands through calving, more once we start the gather." He paused. "I heard what Pruitt asked you. Then you heard what I told him." "I did." He turned his hat in his hands, an old habit, something to do with them when the rest of him was standing still. "I'm not asking on account of that. I'm asking because I've got 12 men eating burnt biscuits and no woman fool enough yet to fix it. Pays fair. Room small, but it's dry. It's through the fall gather is all I can promise. After that we'll see." Sarah studied him a long moment. He did not soften the offer with kindness he did not mean, did not tell her it would be easy, did not look at her the way Pruitt had, weighing her like a horse at auction. He looked at her like a man stating a fact he needed solved. "Through the fall," she said, "and after that we'll see. That's the size of it. I'll take it." She stood, and there was no relief in her face, only the same steadiness that had answered Pruitt on the plank walk, though something in her shoulders eased a fraction, the smallest give, the kind only a man watching closely would have caught. Wyatt caught it. He did not say anything about it. He got down off the bay, took the carpet bag from her before she could argue, and tied it behind the saddle, and that was the whole of the courtship for the first 2 hours, a man loading a bag onto a horse, and a woman climbing up behind him, because there was nowhere else in the world she needed to be more than the place he was offering. They did not talk much on the ride out. He told her the names of the hands she would be feeding, told her where the spring house was, and that the well pump stuck in cold weather and needed a hard first pull, told her his daughter's name was Ruth, and that Ruth had buried her mother 2 winters back, and did not take to strangers easy, and did not need to say more than that for Sarah to understand the shape of the house she was riding into. Sarah told him nothing about herself beyond what he already knew, and he did not ask, and this, too, she understood as a kind of respect, though she could not have said why. The ranch sat low in a bend of the creek, a good house gone a little gray with neglect, a bunkhouse, corrals, a barn that had clearly gotten more of Wyatt's attention than anything else on the place. A girl of about 8 stood on the porch when they rode up, arms crossed, watching the approach with the particular suspicion of a child who has learned that new people in the house rarely stay and rarely improve things when they do. "Ruth," Wyatt said, swinging down. "This is Mrs. Combs. She's going to be cooking for us." Ruth did not answer. She looked at Sarah the way a cat looks at a door left open, curious and unwilling to admit it. And then she turned and went inside without a word, and Wyatt looked apologetic in a way his face was clearly not used to arranging itself into. "She'll come around," he said. "Might take a while." "I've got a while," Sarah said, and picked her own bag up off the ground before he could reach it, and walked toward the house like she had already decided the door was hers to open. Inside, the front room told her the same story the kitchen had. A house kept from falling apart, but not kept up beyond that. A man's hands managing what needed managing, and nothing more. No time or heart left over for the rest. There was a woman's shawl still hung on a peg by the door, faded with dust rather than use. The kind of thing a household keeps not out of purpose, but because nobody has found the courage yet to decide it should be moved. Sarah did not touch it. She hung her own coat on the peg beside it, not over it, and went to find where she'd be sleeping, and if Wyatt noticed, coming through with her carpet bag a minute later, that she had left the shawl exactly where it was, he did not say so, only set the bag down inside the small room off the kitchen and told her supper. For the hands generally went out around 6 and left her to make of the house what she would. The kitchen told her most of what she needed to know about the house before anyone else did. It was a good room gone unloved, a big cook stove with one burner that did not draw right, a pantry with flour gone weevily in the bottom of the barrel, and coffee kept in a rusted tin, and on a shelf above the washstand, pushed to the back where it would not be in anyone's way, a small tin box with a hinged lid dented at one corner that Sarah recognized before she even opened it, because she had carried its twin 4 miles that morning inside her carpet bag. Her mother's recipe box had looked exactly like this one, and inside the stranger's version, she found not recipes, but a woman's handwriting on scraps of paper, faded, clearly not used in some time, and she understood, without being told, that the last woman of this house had kept it, and that nobody since had touched it. She closed the lid gently and set it back exactly where it had been, and went to work on the flour barrel instead. By the second week, the hands had stopped eyeing her plate with the wary look of men who expected to be poisoned by a woman's inexperience, because the food coming out of that kitchen was better than most of them had eaten since leaving their mother's tables. She rose before light to get the coffee right, learned which of the 12 liked their eggs hard and which liked them soft without being told twice, mended a torn shirt for a boy named Dell, who had nobody else to do it and never asked her to, just left it folded on the bunkhouse step with the tier clothes so neat he had to look twice to find where it had been. She did not explain herself and did not perform gratitude earning, and the hands noticed that too, the absence of a woman working for their good opinion, and it made them trust her faster than flattery would have. Ruth held out longer. She watched from doorways. She left the room when Sarah entered it and came back when she thought Sarah wasn't paying attention. She would not eat what Sarah cooked at first, pushing food around her plate until Wyatt's silence across the table became its own kind of instruction. And Sarah never once told the girl to eat, never coaxed, only kept setting a full plate down in front of her every meal, like the refusal from the day before hadn't happened and wouldn't be held against her. It was a Thursday morning, 3 weeks in, that the first crack showed. Sarah found Ruth in the kitchen before dawn, standing on a chair at the counter, trying and failing to reach the coffee tin, and instead of scolding her for being up or being where she shouldn't, Sarah simply lifted the tin down and set it within reach, and said nothing about why a child might want strong coffee at 5 in the morning. only asked if she wanted flapjacks or eggs. And Ruth, caught without her guard raised, said flapjacks before she remembered she wasn't supposed to want anything from this woman yet. "Flapjacks it is," Sarah said, and did not smile too wide about the victory, did not make more of it than it was. And that restraint, more than anything, was what began to move something loose in the girl. Wyatt watched this from the yard through the kitchen window more mornings than he would have admitted, watched the small unspoken negotiations of two people learning each other's edges, and found himself standing at the pump longer than the work required, in no hurry to go back to the barn, telling himself it was only that the coffee was better than it used to be. By the fourth week, Sarah had found the loose board on the third porch step and started stepping around it without thinking, the way you learn a house's habits without meaning to. And one evening she came out to ring the supper bell and found the board gone quiet under her boot, fixed, though nobody had said a word to her about it, and she had said nothing to anyone about it being broken. She looked toward the barn, and Wyatt was already walking away, unhurried, like a man who had simply been passing by with a hammer and had nothing in particular to say about it. Nothing said about the step. She said nothing about it either. But she noticed the way you notice weather changing before anyone announces it, and something in her that had been braced since Daniel died, braced the way you brace for one more thing to go wrong, eased another fraction that evening, standing on a porch that no longer tried to trip her. There were other small changes that spring that neither of them named at the time, but both would remember clearly later, once naming things had become easier. Wyatt began coming in for the noon meal instead of eating cold biscuits in the saddle, the way he'd done since Ezra left, and told himself it was only that the ride back and forth wasn't much trouble. Sarah began setting a second pot of coffee going in the afternoon, more than the house needed, and told herself it was only good sense to have it ready before the hands came in tired. Ruth started leaving her boots by the kitchen door instead of scattering them wherever she'd stepped out of them. And when Sarah asked her once, gently, why the change, the girl only shrugged and said the kitchen smelled better than the rest of the house, and she liked being where the smell was, which was as close to an admission of anything as an 8-year-old was likely to give. And Sarah understood it for the compliment it was, and did not press further. Word travels in a small town the way weather does, low and fast and ahead of itself. And it was not long before people in Larkspur Hollow knew that the widow Pruitt had mocked, was cooking out at the Calder place, and that the hands there had started asking for seconds. Nobody said much about it directly to Wyatt when he came into town for supplies, but he caught the looks, the little recalibrations in people's faces when they remembered the joke about boiling water and set it beside what they were now hearing. And he found he did not care for the joke anymore, though he could not have said exactly when that had changed. At the ranch, the quiet exchanges kept accumulating the way frost builds overnight, one thin layer at a time, until one morning you notice the whole field has changed color. Sarah began keeping a plate warm on the back of the stove on the evenings Wyatt came in late from checking the herd, covered with a cloth. No note, no comment, just there when he walked in cold and hungry, and he began leaving the good cuts of meat for the kitchen instead of the bunkhouse when he butchered, more than the recipe called for, more than 12 men needed, though he never said who the extra was for. Sarah found the tin recipe box moved one afternoon from the high shelf to the counter where she worked, though she had not moved it herself, and understood it as an invitation she had not asked for, and did not know how to answer, except by leaving it there, within reach, unopened for now. Ruth's thaw came the way most real changes come, sideways, through a door nobody was watching. There had been a bad supper, beans scorched on the bottom because Sarah had been out in the yard settling a hen that had gotten loose. And one of the younger hands had made a face at his plate before he caught himself. And Ruth, 8 years old, and until that week barely speaking 2 words to Sarah in a day, had said, flat and certain, "Burnt beans are a serious matter. I don't take them lightly," in a tone so precisely borrowed from an adult's disapproval that the table went silent a beat before it broke into laughter. And Sarah laughed too, surprised into it. And Ruth's own mouth twitched at the corner before she remembered she was supposed to be stern about it. And that was the day the girl started sitting closer to her at the table without seeming to notice she'd done it. It was near the end of that same week that the stew happened, though nobody thought to call it a turning point while it was happening. The hands had spent 2 days in a hard, cold rain, finishing the last of the branding. Miserable work in miserable weather. And they came in that evening soaked through and short-tempered and hungry, in the particular way that makes men either surly or grateful, nothing in between. Sarah had pulled her mother's recipe, at last, from memory rather than the box, a stew she had not made since before Daniel died, thick with root vegetables and a long-simmered beef shank, seasoned the way her own mother had seasoned it, patient and unhurried, built over hours instead of minutes. And she had set the big pot in the center of the table and stepped back the way she always did, without ceremony, without waiting to be praised. The kitchen went quiet in a different way than usual. Dell, who complained about everything on principle, ate 2 full bowls without a word, and then asked, almost shy about it, if there might be a third. Another hand said it was the best thing he'd eaten since his own mother's table, years back, and meant it plainly enough that nobody teased him for saying it. Ruth ate without being coaxed, without pushing food around her plate, finished her bowl, and looked up, and said, not to the table in general, but to Sarah directly, "Can I have the recipe when I'm grown?" And something in the plainness of a child asking for a future that included this woman in it landed on Sarah harder than she expected, and she had to look down at the pot a moment before she trusted her voice enough to say yes. Wyatt had come in last, wet through to the skin, dropped into his chair without much appetite left after 2 hard days, and took a spoonful more out of duty than hunger. He went still. It was not a large stillness, not the kind anyone but Sarah would have caught. A pause with the spoon halfway back to the bowl, his eyes lifting to her across the table and staying there a beat longer than the moment required. He did not say anything about it. He finished the bowl, and then a second, slower than the men around him, and when Sarah reached to take his empty bowl at the end of supper, their hands did not quite touch, and both of them were careful that they didn't. And neither of them said a word about any of it, though later, alone in the barn checking on a mare that didn't need checking on, Wyatt stood a long time in the dark, turning over the plain, uncomfortable fact that he had just eaten a bowl of stew, and understood, all at once, and without wanting to, that he did not want this woman to leave in the fall. He thought, standing there in the dark with the mare shifting quietly in her stall, of the shawl still hanging on its peg by the door, of the 2 winters he had let pass, without deciding what to do about it, not from grief exactly, or not only that, but from a kind of tiredness that had settled into him after his wife died and never quite lifted, a man who had carried too much for too long, long enough that he had stopped noticing the weight. He realized, turning the thought over the way he turned his hat, that he had stopped noticing it lately. He could not say exactly which week that had happened, only that it had, and that the noticing of its absence felt like the first honest thing he had felt in longer than he wanted to admit. Sarah understood it too, though she fought the understanding harder than he did, because she had buried a husband not 2 years past and did not trust herself yet to know the difference between gratitude for kindness and something larger, trying to grow in the same soil. She told herself the stillness she had seen cross his face was only a tired man glad of a hot meal. She told herself the same about the mended porch step, the extra cuts of meat. The plate kept warm going both directions now, because she had started noticing that her own coffee cup was refilled. Before she asked, that wood had been split and stacked closer to the kitchen door than the distance required. Small, unclaimed kindnesses moving toward her, the way hers moved toward him, neither one naming what either was doing. She began keeping the tin box open on the counter after that, adding her own scraps of paper beside the faded handwriting already there, not replacing it, setting her stew recipe next to whoever had written down a bread recipe years before in a hand she never asked about, and Wyatt never explained. It felt doing this like she was writing herself quietly into a story that had already been going on before she arrived. Not erasing what came first, only continuing it. And there was something in that continuation that steadied her more than any promise could have. Ruth's change deepened past the stew. She began following Sarah through chores that did not need a child's help, learning to crimp a pie crust with small, serious hands, asking questions about her own mother that she had apparently never asked anyone. And Sarah answered what she could from what Wyatt had told her, and did not pretend to know more than that. And one evening, helping shell peas on the porch step, Ruth leaned her head against Sarah's arm without announcement, the way children do when trust arrives before they've decided to allow it, and fell half asleep there in the last of the daylight. And Sarah sat very still so as not to disturb it, feeling something in her chest that she had not let herself feel in 11 months, something that was not quite happiness yet but stood very close to its door. Wyatt found them like that, coming up from the barn, and stopped at the edge of the yard rather than announce himself, watching a woman who was not his wife holding his daughter loose against her shoulder in the porch light. And the sight of it did something to him that he did not have words for, and did not try very hard to find them, only stood there a while in the dusk, and then went in the back way instead of up the front steps, quiet, so as not to wake either one of them. By the time the first cold nights of the season arrived, the household had settled into a rhythm that none of the three of them spoke of directly, but all of them had come separately to depend on. The hands no longer joked about Pruitt's question at all. If anything, the story had reversed itself in the retelling around town, become a story about a fool rancher who had turned away good help and a widow who had proved him wrong without raising her voice to do it. Sarah heard a version of it secondhand from the mercantile owner's wife, delivered kindly, meant as praise, and found she did not mind the story being told now, because the ending had changed enough that it no longer stung to hear it. What neither Sarah nor Wyatt said aloud, not yet, not to each other, and barely to themselves, was that the season they had agreed to, through the fall gather and then we'll see, was drawing closer with every cooling night, and that both of them had begun to dread the arrival of that reckoning, almost as much as they had once dreaded being strangers to each other, because a temporary arrangement had quietly stopped feeling temporary to either one of them, and neither had yet found the plain words to say so. Sarah felt it most on the morning she woke before the house did, in the gray hour before the rooster started, when the kitchen was hers alone, and the stove had not yet been coaxed back to life. She would stand a moment in that quiet, with her hand on the cold iron of the stove, remembering the kitchen she'd shared with Daniel, small and poorly built, and hers in a way this borrowed kitchen was not, Not yet, not officially, and she would feel the old grief rise the way it still did sometimes, unannounced, and then feel underneath it, newer and less certain of its welcome, something that did not want to leave this kitchen either. And she did not know yet what to do with two feelings that seemed, some mornings, to be pulling in opposite directions, except to light the stove and start the coffee and let the work of the day carry her past the question until she had the courage to sit with it properly. The trouble arrived the way trouble usually did in Larkspur Hollow, dressed as concern and carried by Mrs. Odell, whose voice was built for distance and whose opinions traveled faster than any letter. She had never approved of women hired off the plank walk taking up residence in a widower's house, and she said so to anyone who would stand still long enough, framing it each time as worry prepared fresh at home, worry for poor motherless Ruth, worry for a good man's reputation, worry, always worry, dressed up neat enough that it took people a while to notice there was no kindness folded into it anywhere. It might have stayed no more than talk, the kind that wears itself out eventually, if Daniel's cousin Amos Rourke had not chosen that same week to ride into the valley. Amos had never had much use for Sarah while Daniel was alive, and had less use for her now that Daniel was dead, and there was a small parcel of land, the place Sarah had left behind, sitting with a debt on it that Amos had quietly bought up from the bank without telling anyone why. He came to Larkspur Hollow claiming Sarah owed him settlement on her husband's obligations, claiming she had abandoned the land and the debt both, and he was not shy about saying, loudly and in the mercantile where it would travel fastest, that a woman who could run off from her own dead husband's affairs to keep house for another man was hardly the sort deserving of anyone's sympathy. The two stories, Mrs. Odell's quiet poison and Amos's loud grievance, found each other in the town's imagination, the way two small fires find each other in dry grass. And within days, the talk had grown a shape uglier than either piece alone. A story about a scheming widow who had worked her way into a rich rancher's house and was now dodging her debts besides. And though not a soul who had actually eaten at Sarah's table believed a word of it, there were plenty who had not eaten at that table and were glad enough for something new to chew on. Sarah heard the worst of it from Dell, who came to her white-faced and apologetic, having overheard it in town and not known how else to warn her, except to say it plain. She took the news the way she took most things, still on the surface, and went on with supper, as if nothing had shifted. But that night, alone in her small room off the kitchen, she sat a long while with her mother's letters spread on the quilt and let herself feel, finally and privately, the old fear that had never fully left her since Daniel's death. The fear of being a woman with no standing of her own, dependent on other people's decisions about her worth. One bad rumor away from having nowhere to go again. Wyatt heard it differently, heard it as a direct accusation against a household he had built and a woman he had come, without ever saying so, to consider essential to it, and something in him that had been patient and taciturn his whole life went hard and quiet, in a new way. Not the quiet of a man who has stopped noticing the weight he carries, but the quiet of a man who has finally noticed exactly how much he is willing to carry for someone else's sake. He rode into town the next morning before light, said little to anyone about where he was going, and Sarah watched him go from the kitchen window with a knot in her chest she did not have a name for yet, something between fear that he meant to settle it the hard way, and a fear stranger still, that he might come back having decided the trouble wasn't worth keeping her for. Ruth, sensing more than she was told, stayed close to Sarah all that day, quiet in a way that was not her usual quiet, and at one point, without preamble, took Sarah's hand while they were pinning wash to the line and held it there a moment, saying nothing, and Sarah understood it as the child's own plain declaration, the same kind her father made, action instead of words, and she held on and did not let herself cry in front of the girl, though it cost her something to manage that. Wyatt came back well past dark, mud to the knees of his horse, and said little about where he'd ridden or what he'd found beyond telling Sarah, plain and certain, not to worry herself further over Amos Rourke's claim, that he'd seen to it and it would keep till Saturday. He did not elaborate, and Sarah did not press him, though she noticed he ate almost nothing at supper, and sat a long while afterward at the table with a ledger and a stack of papers he did not usually bother with. And she understood, watching him from the stove, that whatever he had ridden 2 hours in the cold to confirm, he intended to make sure of it twice before he was satisfied, because he was not a man who went into a fight, even a quiet one fought with paper, without knowing exactly where he stood. The town held its annual harvest social that Saturday in the church hall, tables of food and the whole valley crowded in against the first real cold of the season, and Sarah nearly did not go, told Wyatt she would rather stay back with Ruth. But Wyatt said, plain and without room for argument, that they were going, all three of them, and that she was not going to hide from a thing she had done nothing wrong to cause, and something in the flatness of his certainty made her go get her coat. The hall was full when they arrived, the long tables loaded with dishes from every kitchen in the valley, and the room did the thing rooms do when a subject of gossip walks into it, a ripple of attention pretending not to be attention, conversations picking up just slightly too fast. Amos Rourke was there, near the punch table, already talking loud to anyone who'd listen about widows and debts and men who ought to know better than to shelter them, and Mrs. Odell stood near enough to nod along, her concern freshly prepared for the occasion. It might have stayed at that ugly talk in a corner if Amos had not decided, emboldened by an hour of nobody stopping him, to say it directly, loud enough for the hall to hear, that Sarah Combs owed a debt she was hiding from behind Calder's good name, and that decent people ought to know what kind of woman they were setting a place for at their table. The hall went properly quiet then, the kind of silence that has weight to it, and every face turned toward Sarah, who stood very still, chin level, the same way she had stood on the plank walk months before, waiting to see whether this town would ask its old question again. Wyatt crossed the room before anyone else moved, unhurried, the way he did everything, and stopped in front of Amos close enough that the man had to look up at him. "That debt," Wyatt said, loud enough for the room, quiet enough not to shout, "was on a piece of land Sarah signed away her claim to the day she left it, free and clear, which the bank in town can confirm for anybody fool enough to still doubt it after I already wrote in and confirmed it myself 3 days back. You bought paper on a debt that isn't hers to carry anymore, and you know it. And you've been saying otherwise around this town because it's easier than admitting you rode 2 days for nothing." The room's attention swung to Amos, whose face went through several colors before settling on something sullen and cornered, and he had no answer ready that wouldn't make the lie worse for having told it so loudly, so he said nothing at all, which the town, watching closely, understood well enough as the answer. Wyatt turned then, not to the room, but to Sarah, and said the second thing, quieter, meant for her, though he did not care who else heard it. "Can you even boil water?" he said, and let the old joke sit a moment before he answered it himself. "I've eaten better in that kitchen these past months than in the whole rest of my life put together, and it was never about the water." He looked around at the room, at Mrs. Odell in particular, whose concern had gone very still and very small under the weight of being looked at directly. Anybody in this hall who's got something honest to say about Sarah Combs, say it to her now, in front of me. Anybody who's only got the other kind, I'd ask you to keep it because I'm done letting it stand. Nobody said anything at all. The silence stretched and then, slowly, broke apart into small, ordinary sounds. Someone clearing a throat, a chair scraping, the hall remembering how to be a hall again, and Mrs. Odell found somewhere else to stand, and Amos found his hat, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. And the town, watching all of it, stored the whole evening up the way it stored everything, to be repeated later, though the story it told after that night had a different shape than the one it had been telling before. And neither Amos nor Mrs. Odell had much taste for correcting it. The mercantile owner's wife, who had once been among the first to pass along the ugliest version of the story, was seen that same night, bringing Sarah a plate of her own cobbler unasked, saying only that she thought Sarah might want something sweet after a hard evening, which was as close to an apology as the woman was built to give. And Sarah took the plate and thanked her plainly and did not make her say more than that, understanding that some corrections in a small town arrived dressed as cobbler rather than as words, and that the receiving of them graciously was its own kind of grace. They rode home mostly in silence, Ruth asleep against Sarah's shoulder in the back of the wagon, the cold coming down off the ridge, and the light long gone, the kind of quiet that follows a storm once it has finally passed through and left the air clearer than before. Wyatt carried Ruth in first and put her to bed without waking her fully, and when he came back down, Sarah was still in the kitchen, not doing anything in particular, standing near the stove with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She wasn't really drinking, and he stood in the doorway a moment before he came the rest of the way in. "I should have said that months ago," he said. "The part about the water. You said it when it needed saying." Sarah set the cup down. "Not before that would have made a difference." He nodded, turned his hat over once in his hands, an old habit, and then set it down on the table entirely, which she noticed because he never put it down, always held it or wore it, and the small act of setting it aside seemed to cost him something to do, a kind of exposure he was not used to allowing himself. "I'm not a man who talks around things," he said, "so I won't start now." He looked at her steady, the same way he'd looked at her the day he offered her the job, stating something rather than asking for it, except this time there was nothing transactional left in his voice at all. "I'm asking you to stay, permanent, as my wife, if that's what you'd want." He paused, and the pause was deliberate, not uncertain. "It's your choice, Sarah. Whichever way you decide, you've got a place here regardless, you and no obligation past that. I'm not asking you to answer tonight if you're not ready. Take whatever time you need to make it." He did not fill the silence that followed. He let it sit, unhurried, the way he let most things sit, and Sarah stood in the quiet kitchen with the stove ticking as it cooled and thought of the plank walk in spring, of Pruitt's question and her own flat answer, of a small tin box moved from a high shelf to a counter within reach, of a mended porch step and a plate kept warm and a child falling asleep against her arm without asking permission first, of 11 months of grief that had somewhere in this house, without her quite noticing the exact day, stopped being the only thing she carried. "I don't need the time," she said. "Yes." She held his eyes and did not look away from the weight of what she was saying. "That's what I want." Neither of them moved for a moment, the two words settling into the room the way words do when they have been a long time coming, and arrive finally exactly as plain as they were meant to be. And then Wyatt crossed the kitchen, slow, and Sarah did not step back, and outside, the wind came down off the ridge and moved through the pines the way it did every night in that country, indifferent to what had just been decided inside the house. And inside the house, nobody minded that indifference at all, because for the first time in a long while, neither one of them needed the weather or anything else to notice what had happened between them. It had happened. That was enough. Nearly a month later, the valley had gone gold and then brown in the way it does before the first real snow. The cottonwoods along the creek bare-branched, the last of the hay put up in the barn. The herd moved down to the low pasture for the winter. The wedding had been small, held in the church hall, where the town's opinion of Sarah had turned itself around, with a cake made not by Sarah, who was firmly told she was not permitted to cook her own wedding supper, but by the same mercantile owner's wife, who had once passed along Amos Rourke's version of the story, and now told a different one at every opportunity, usually beginning with the stew. The house had changed in ways that were mostly small and mostly permanent. Ruth called her mama now, had started it on her own one ordinary Tuesday over breakfast, no ceremony to it at all, just the word arriving naturally into a sentence about whether there was more honey for the biscuits, and Sarah had answered the question about the honey and said nothing about the word, because some things did not need commenting on to be understood. And that evening, Wyatt had found Sarah standing very still at the stove a while, not upset, just holding something in her chest that needed a minute before she trusted herself to keep working. And he had not asked what it was, only put his hand briefly at the small of her back on his way past, and let that be enough. The tin recipe box sat open on the kitchen counter most days now, no longer pushed to a high shelf out of anyone's way, filled with the first woman's faded handwriting and Sarah's newer additions both, sitting comfortably beside each other, the way two different hands can share a single page without either one erasing the other. And Ruth had begun adding her own scrap of paper to it too, in careful 8-year-old letters, a recipe for flapjacks copied down word for word from the way Sarah made them, because she had decided, without asking anyone's permission, that the box belonged to her as much as to either of the women who came before. The porch step held firm under everyone's boots now, fixed for good with a fresh board that matched the others, close enough you'd have to know to look for it. And some evenings Sarah stood on it, just to feel it not give beneath her. A small, private habit she never explained to anyone, and never needed to. On the first cold Thursday of real winter, snow finally down over the ridge and settling into the fence lines, Sarah made the stew again, the same recipe from that rain-soaked evening back in the fall, thick with root vegetables and a long simmered shank, and the hands came in from checking the herd in the low pasture, stamping snow off their boots and talking loud about the cold, and the kitchen filled with the particular warmth of a house that has enough food and enough people who belong in it. And Ruth set the table without being asked, and Wyatt came in last, same as always, and this time did not wait for the spoonful to reach his mouth before he looked at Sarah across the room. And this time, neither one of them looked away first. And this time, there was nothing underneath the look that either of them needed to keep hidden anymore. The cabin held its warmth that evening, and every evening after, not waiting for anyone to arrive and fill it. Not anymore. And that was the story of Sarah Combs, a widow who walked into Larkspur Hollow with an empty carpet bag, and one hard question laughed at her back, and left it in the end with a mended porch step, a full recipe box, a daughter who called her mama over breakfast, and a home nobody in that valley would ever again mistake for temporary. Ruth would tell the story herself years later, grown to her own children, and by then the details had softened the way details do with time. The exact words of Pruitt's question forgotten by everyone but Sarah, who kept them not out of hurt anymore, but as a kind of measuring stick, a way of knowing exactly how far a person could travel from one cold morning on a plank walk to a warm kitchen full of people who loved her. If she only kept walking and did not let the question decide who she was, and that this, more than any recipe in the tin box, was the true inheritance she meant to leave behind for the daughter who had chosen her as surely as she had chosen the daughter, plate by plate, quiet act by quiet act, until neither of them could remember a version of the family that did not include the other. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.